The Korean War ended in 1953, but Korea never received peace. That sounds like a contradiction, but it is the reality still shaping Seoul, Pyongyang, Washington, Beijing, and the wider East Asian security map. The guns mostly stopped. The armies pulled back. The world called it the end of the war, but no peace treaty settled the conflict. So if the war ended, why does the Korean Peninsula still look like it is preparing for the next one? Share this video with someone who only sees North Korea and South Korea as drama, threat, or propaganda. And subscribe to Korea Radar if you want the Korean Peninsula explained with context, not slogans. Because the Korean War is not only history, it is the operating system behind the peninsula today. Imagine the future of Korea for a second. A reunified peninsula, or two hostile states, a nuclear North Korea, a high-tech South Korea. American troops still stationed there. China still watching the border. Japan still reading every missile launch as a warning. Russia now closer to Pyongyang than it was a decade ago. The Korean War is usually placed safely in the past, 1950 to 1953. But the system it created is still active. The open loop is simple. The war did not continue as constant shooting. It changed form. And once you understand that, the DMZ stops looking like a border and starts looking like a frozen front line. The story begins on June 25, 1950. North Korea invaded South Korea. The North aimed to reunify the peninsula by force under its system. South Korea was not ready for the speed of the attack. Seoul fell quickly. The South Korean government retreated. The United States and the United Nations moved to defend the South. Then the war turned again. UN forces pushed back. The Incheon landing changed the momentum. North Korean forces retreated. The UN side crossed the 38th parallel and advanced toward the Chinese border. Then China entered the war. What began as a Korean Civil War became a Cold War battlefield. North Korea had Chinese support and Soviet backing. South Korea had American and UN support. The peninsula became the place where local Korean claims, superpower rivalry, Chinese security fears, and global ideology all collided. That is the first reason the war never truly ended. It was never only one war. It was a civil war, a proxy war, a national liberation struggle, depending on who was telling the story, a Cold War test, and a regional security crisis all at once. So when people ask why peace was so hard, the answer is not just North versus South. It was Seoul, Pyongyang, Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and the United Nations all tied into one battlefield. And no side wanted an ending that made it look like it had lost. By 1951, the war had largely become a grinding stalemate. The front line moved less. Negotiations began. Soldiers kept fighting for hills and positions that mattered less for total victory and more for bargaining power. This is where many documentaries focus on battles. But Korea Radar's question is different. Why did the war stop without peace? The answer is the armistice. An armistice is not the same thing as a peace treaty. A peace treaty tries to settle the political conflict. An armistice stops the fighting. It tells the armies to halt. It creates rules. It creates lines. It creates mechanisms to reduce immediate war. But it does not answer the deeper question. Who is the legitimate Korea? Who rules the peninsula? Is the division temporary or permanent? Can both systems coexist? The 1953 Korean Armistice Agreement stopped open combat, but it did not create diplomatic peace. The Geneva talks in 1954 failed to produce a final peace treaty. So the armistice became the substitute for peace. That is the core of the entire video. The war did not end with reconciliation. It ended with management. And managing a conflict is not the same as resolving it. Here is the detail that surprises many people. South Korea did not sign the armistice. Syngman Rhee opposed an agreement that ended the fighting without reunifying the peninsula. He wanted the war to continue until Korea was unified under the South. The United States did not want that. China and North Korea did not want surrender. The UN coalition wanted the killing to stop. So the armistice was signed by military commanders representing the United Nations Command, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers. South Korea was the country being defended, but its president rejected the deal. That fact alone tells you why the war remained politically unfinished. The South survived, but did not get reunification. The North survived, but failed to conquer the South. China preserved a buffer state, but paid heavily. The United States prevented communist control of the entire peninsula, but did not achieve final victory. Everyone could claim something. Nobody got everything. That is how stalemates become permanent. Now look at what the Armistice physically created: the demilitarized zone. The DMZ is often treated like a symbol. Tourists visit nearby observation points. Cameras show blue buildings at Panmunjom. News reports use it as a visual shorthand for tension. But the DMZ is not just a symbol. It is the physical memory of the war. It is roughly 4 kilometers wide. It sits around the military demarcation line. It separates two heavily armed military systems. And it exists because the armistice froze the front line where the fighting stopped. That means the Korean border is not like a normal border between two settled states. It is a ceasefire line. Think about that. A normal border says, this is where one country ends and another begins. The DMZ says, this is where the armies stopped. That is a very different message. If this already makes the DMZ feel less like a border and more like an unfinished war machine, subscribe to Korea Radar. This is exactly why Korea has to be explained through systems, not just headlines or battlefield maps. The DMZ affects soldiers, it affects civilians near the border, it affects land access, it affects military planning, it affects alliance strategy, it affects diplomacy, it affects how both governments teach security to their people. And it does something else. It keeps the memory of 1950 alive in the geography of today. The war is not only remembered in museums. It is built into fences, mines, watchtowers, artillery positions, military exercises, command structures, and emergency plans. This is why the war ended is too simple. The shooting stopped at scale. The confrontations stayed. Now we have to look at the alliances. After 1953, both Koreas were forced to think about survival. South Korea had survived invasion, but it remained vulnerable. North Korea had survived destruction, but it also knew the South was backed by the world's strongest military power. So the South built its security around the United States alliance. American forces remained on the peninsula. The U.S. ROK alliance became central to South Korea's defense. United Nations Command continued to manage the Armistice structure. Later, Combined Forces Command became part of how the two militaries prepared for war. This made South Korea safer. But it also made the war global even after 1953, because any new major conflict on the peninsula would not only involve Seoul and Pyongyang, it could involve the United States. It could pull in China, it could affect Japan, it could shake the global economy. Now look from Pyongyang's side. North Korea saw the U.S. presence not as protection, but as a permanent threat. It saw South Korea not as a normal neighbor, but as a rival state backed by a superpower. It saw military exercises as preparation. It saw sanctions as pressure. It saw the American nuclear umbrella as an existential danger. You do not have to accept Pyongyang's claims to understand its logic. That distinction matters. Analysis is not approval. North Korea built its modern security doctrine around survival under pressure. Over time, that meant more emphasis on missiles, nuclear weapons, internal control, and deterrence. This is where the Korean War connects directly to today. North Korea's nuclear program is not only about prestige. It is not only about bargaining. It is not only about ideology. It is tied to the leadership's belief that the unfinished war never truly disappeared. From Pyongyang's perspective, nuclear weapons help prevent invasion, regime collapse, and forced reunification under the South. From Seoul's perspective, those weapons create a permanent threat over South Korean cities and citizens. From Washington's perspective, they threaten American forces and possibly the U.S. homeland. From Beijing's perspective, instability in North Korea could create refugees, loose weapons, and a U.S.-aligned Korea on China's border. That is why the war never really ended. Because every major player still sees the peninsula through security fears formed by the war, and fear can keep a conflict alive longer than gunfire. Now bring this into the present. In 2024, North Korea moved further away from the old language of reunification. Kim Jong-un and North Korean state messaging began framing South Korea more openly as a hostile foreign state. Road and rail links between the two sides were also cut in line with that harder separation. This matters. For decades, both Koreas had different visions of reunification, but they still claimed some version of one Korean future. The North wanted reunification under its system. The South's constitution still claims the entire Korean Peninsula as national territory, even while Seoul governs only the South. So the idea of one Korea never disappeared. But the newer North Korean language pushes something darker. Not one people temporarily divided, two hostile states. That shift is not just political theater. It changes how the next generation is taught to imagine the other side. A South Korean is no longer only a separated compatriot in official North Korean framing. South Korea becomes foreign, hostile, permanent. That is the war changing form again. First it was bullets, then it was the armistice. Then it was alliances, then it was nuclear deterrence. Now it is political identity. And if identity hardens, diplomacy becomes even harder. That is the part people miss when they treat the Korean War as old history. The war is still deciding what words are allowed. Reunification, enemy, compatriot, hostile state, peace, deterrence, sovereignty. These words are not decoration, they shape policy. In 2026, North Korea again rejected denuclearization language and framed its nuclear status as irreversible. At the same time, South Korea and the United States continue to discuss deterrence, sanctions, dialogue, and phased approaches to the nuclear problem. That tells you something important. Even when leaders talk about diplomacy, they are not starting from peace. They are starting from an unfinished war, and that changes every negotiation. If the war were truly over, the question would be normal relations. But because it is unresolved, the question becomes survival. Can Pyongyang trust security guarantees? Can Seoul accept a nuclear North Korea? Can Washington reduce the threat without weakening the alliance? Can Beijing tolerate a collapse or reunification scenario? Can Japan feel safe if missiles keep flying over the region? These are not theoretical questions. They affect military budgets, missile defense, sanctions, food policy, border restrictions, election debates, conscription, intelligence planning, and how ordinary Koreans imagine the future. A young South Korean man does military service partly because the war never became peace. A North Korean child grows up under state messaging shaped by siege mentality. A farmer near the border lives with access restrictions because the front line never became a normal frontier. A diplomat discussing nuclear weapons is really negotiating with the ghost of 1953. That is the human layer. The unfinished war is not only about generals and presidents, it sits inside daily life. It sits inside families separated since the war. It sits inside elderly Koreans who may never see relatives again. It sits inside the fear that one artillery exchange, one border incident, one missile test, or one political miscalculation could become something much larger. The Korean Peninsula does not need constant fighting to remain dangerous. It only needs unresolved rules, hostile assumptions, and weapons pointed in opposite directions. Now return to the opening contradiction. The Korean War ended in 1953, but Korea never received peace. That is not a slogan. It is a structural fact. The armistice stopped open fighting, but it preserved the rival claims. The DMZ separated the armies, but it did not reconcile the states. The alliances protected both sides from defeat, but they also kept the conflict international. Nuclear weapons raised the cost of war, but they also made peace harder to define. And now hostile state language risks turning a temporary division into a permanent identity. This is why the war never really ended. Not because soldiers are still fighting the same battles every day, but because the system created by the war still runs. The armistice still matters. The DMZ still matters. U.S. forces still matter. Chinese strategy still matters. North Korean nuclear weapons still matter. South Korean defense planning still matters. And the question of Korean legitimacy still has no agreed answer. So here are the three things most people miss. First, the Korean War did not end with peace. It ended with an armistice, and an armistice freezes a conflict instead of solving it. Second, the DMZ is not just a border. It is the old battlefield turned into a permanent security structure. Third, the war survives through systems, alliances, military commands, nuclear deterrence, hostile political language, and the unresolved question of which future Korea is supposed to have. Write your view in the comments. What keeps the Korean War unresolved today? The armistice, the DMZ, nuclear weapons, or foreign alliances? And subscribe to Korea Radar if you want clear, serious analysis on North Korea, South Korea, and East Asia. because on the Korean Peninsula, the past is not behind the border, it is guarding it.